preconceptions and the way in which we think about the human condition today. So we're very lucky to be joined by, my name's Thomas Roueche, I'm the editor of Tank magazine, and we're very lucky to be joined by Janne, who's a writer most recently whose most recent book is War, which I think challenges our perception of how we tend to see war, particularly from within the European context. Esther Freud is the author most recently of Mr. Mac and Me, which she's written very elegantly about how it was inspired by ghostly presences within her home. Ciler Ilhan is a Turkish writer, Sabyn Javeri, this book, Nobody Killed Her, talks about a female friendship and an assassination attempt. And Ciler Ilhan is a Turkish writer whose book, Exile, brings together a variety of real and fictional voices. So I think between them there's a very broad range of different ways of thinking about the human condition in its fullest sense. So I just wanted to start off by asking each of the panelists in turn to talk about how they see art as relating to the human condition and commenting on it and helping us understand it. So, Janne, if you want to go ahead.
This is a subject. Okay, as I said, this we could talk about all afternoon, but I'll try in short to give my vision of the subject. I have written about something I call the human gap, because I think as human beings, we are one thing how we present ourselves depending on the cultures we live in or interact in, what the expectations to us are, and then our inner being, what we know, and it's a deep, almost biological sense of right and wrong. And depending on how we live, that gap can be bigger or smaller. And I think for the moment, with all the technology that encourages people to just present themselves from the outside in social media, the gap gets bigger and bigger because we are always presenting ourselves on the outside, not building that inner human being we are. But that is what I think art speaks to. And different art speaks in different ways to that. You know, the music or visual arts very in an essential way. But literature works in a different way, because if you look at a book, we have no sensory response. It could be a manual for a car motor or a legal text. It's only when, as a reader, you put your imagination into what each of those words add up to, that there is a visual and there's a sensual response to what the text is. We have to, the writing only comes alive in the imagination of the reader. And it's that activation of the imagination that makes me think that's where literature really builds the human being. Because you take away the outside of how you present yourself to the world and enter an imagined world, which could be anyone's. It can be Nigerian or Pakistani or Danish, but you go into these human beings and the universe that you don't know. You have an experience that, as if you have lived it, even if you don't identify with any specific of the characters, you enter that literary universe that is presented to you, and therefore you come out of it afterwards having lived a life that isn't your own, but having gone through the emotions and experiences as if they were you, and that builds us. When we emotionally respond to all these different experiences, that even if only imagined, we actually respond to them. And then we learn what we feel is right or wrong, how we want to be treated or not, because we see how others react to how they are treated or not. So we strengthen that inner being and thereby narrow the human gap. So, of course, this can be done also by normal storytelling. I think for people who are illiterate or who don't have access to books, storytelling in all communities throughout time have been extremely important, because I think it does the same. But in our modern world, literature is, I think, what reaches our inner soul, and strengthen us, also so that we can't be taken over by any zeitgeist. Like we heard about the Trumpism this morning. It was in former times the Nazism, but I think any form of extremism, whether religious, political, or just personal, you cannot be taken over by it if you have a strong inner core. So that's why it is so important that we allow our souls to be built in moments where we have no pretense, and that's when we read. Or read literature.
I was thinking this morning during the panel, the first panel, about somebody said that when our human needs are met, the need to be fed and to have something to drink and to feel safe, then what do people do? And I thought immediately they start being creative. And they start to make things, and that's what people have always done. They've written poetry and painted pictures. And I notice in my own life that whenever I've needed any kind of consolation, I've turned to sort of the making of art in some way, even if it was embroidering something or knitting, or someone was saying that someone distressed in their family was just soothing themselves by colouring, as young children do. And I think that within literature, people have always turned either to the writing of it or to the reading of it as a kind of soothing consolation. There's a column in one of the British papers that says, what would you never leave the house without? And for me, I would never leave the house without a book. I actually feel nervous to be without a book. I just know I'll always be okay if I have one. I'll be able to reset myself with somebody else's story, which will become my story as I read it. And I noticed recently, actually, that it seems to be a theme in my own books, that one of the characters is usually making something, often painting. My father was an artist, and I often have a character who's creating art rather than writing, but sort of painting. And I think I go back over and over again to the example I had growing up, that there was the person sort of right at the center of my life, and all he was ever doing was trying to make something out of the life that was around him. So I think that affected me much more profoundly than I realized, because I noticed that I'm people say when you write books you find out what you're interested in, and that's after 8 novels I'm really discovering the themes are occurring. So thank you.
Talking about when people's needs are met and they become more creative. Sometimes it's the other way around. Sometimes when your needs are not being met, literature or art becomes a way to voice that. And often in our part of the world, having grown up during dictatorship, art becomes a political tool to express yourself. So whether it's writing, or whether it's the visual arts, or whether it's PTV dramas, art is a way to get that message across. It allows us that space which perhaps reporting doesn't do. And in our history, if you were to even look at the partition, often it's fiction which humanizes the trauma of partition, or which really makes you empathetic towards what happened, gives you this insight into the human condition of whether it's partition, whether it's other defining events like 9/11, whether it's World War. I feel literature is what really, really brings you into the human condition. And as Janne mentioned, the idea of the human gap, I feel it bridges that gap. So for me, I think art is a very important political tool to express those gaps, to fill those gaps in the human condition. And that's about it. So.
Primo Levi, he's Italian Jewish who survived the Holocaust. I'm not Jewish, I'm not Kurdish, I'm not a gypsy. But I write about them because I'm a writer who wants to understand them. He said, which struck me really and stayed with me, it happened, therefore it can happen again. This is the core of what we have to say. So that is basically my approach towards humanity, being human. A bit skeptical, but not very pessimistic at some times. I'm a member of PEN, the International Writers Committee, Turkish PEN and Dutch PEN, and I do many meetings with them. We do congresses, and actually this is one of the things that we also discuss at sometimes. Can we really fight with our pens against brutality, violence, against war, against weapons? And sometimes we get into a fight, nice small arguments, of course, what I mean by a fight. So I just want to cite a short example, because Turkish Republic, after the Ottoman Empire was built in 1923, and then we had a wave of writers who thought they should educate the people. To me, that is the duty of selected people, government, who should really come with a good strategy to educate people so that they can live in more human conditions. And the people in Turkey who were doing like literature, art were despised for many years. Like she's or he's so individualistic, she's not thinking about the people. But those avant-garde artists are the ones who maybe understood the core of humanity better. And having said this, I'm not saying maybe as a writer at some point in your life, in your nation, because nations also are born, grow up, get old, so maybe in some stage you might need that kind of artist. There is nothing wrong with it, but this is my personal approach to art, and I really have to, I really do agree with my colleagues who were basically saying the same thing. My character in the novel that I'm writing has a Jewish background, and one has a Kurdish background. So imagine my misery in all of my research, and this is the motto that I came up with to save my own personal miserable life when I'm writing this novel. Otherwise, I'm going to cut my wrist or something. So, and doing all this research, I realized, really, as a person, maybe unless you're a superhero, and I do believe in miracles, but I'm not. As a person, you cannot save the whole world, but you can save one neighbor. And you can save that one neighbor trying to understand that neighbor. This is what literature does. The human gap, the insight, this is what my other colleague writers have been talking about. So I think being human is a very complicated issue, and by literature, by art, when you can get an insight to that person, then you don't want to kill that person anymore, maybe. Thank you.
So I guess I would want to ask, I mean, do you feel as panelists that there's an obligation to towards a political commitment within the works that you write, in terms of an obligation to bridge that gap, to kind of address the human condition within the characters that you write? And is that something that you consciously grapple with in your work?
I mean, I do, because maybe I feel I'm very strongly a political being, but I also respect that I know writers who write poetry and who are fantastic at describing some human emotions, and they don't necessarily feel they engage directly in the political context. Should work, okay, yeah. But then again, I think any piece of literary writing is political, because even if you write a poem about a tree, it shows something about priority, it shows something about how you understand the importance of nature in this world. So all literature is political in its nature. But I think if you have a political purpose, if you have a direct political purpose with what you write, often the literary value is right then and there, because then you and it's no longer a quest of the imagination, which I think literature has to be to work. Because again, you have to be able to think, if you were these characters in these situations in this fictitious world, you would feel and act the same way as these characters do. That's where it becomes relevant for you as a person. But where I address politics was through my essays. In the novels, I more always try to search for aspects of the human conditions. Except for one little passport book I've done where I changed around the refugee situation. It's more, you can say, in between. That's why I call it a fictitious essay, where, you know, it's generally set in a Western European country, and I make war in that country, and you follow a family fleeing, generally it's to Egypt, where I make peace and prosperity and democracy, and you have this family from Western Europe go through all the same in the asylum process that normal refugees generally from the Middle East go through when they come to Europe for the moment. And for identification in this book, I found that I have to change it so it's adapted to each country where it's published. So like in Denmark, it's war in the Nordic countries and a Danish family. In the French, it's a war in Central Europe and a French family fleeing from Paris to Egypt and so on. Because exactly that identification is essential, and it's a very short book, and there it's that direct identification with what if war were here, I take the reader through. Whereas normally in literature, the identification comes more from imagining a whole different life, but you need more space to get the reader into that. But yeah, I do think literature, because it changes the way people see things and think about life, it also can change the world, but it works long term. You can't put out a fire with literature. You can't stop the war in Syria writing a novel about it now, but you may prevent the next fire or the next war, you know, in some groups of people at least. Or you may make more people, you know, run with water to put out the fire if they understand how it is to be consumed by fire. So it's just to understand literature works long term, but does have a very strong political impact in that way.
I think that sometimes when countries are going through real hardship, there is a real feeling that if only there was one book that could kind of make a real change. I remember going to a festival in Palestine, and somebody in the audience saying, you know, who's going to write this book that will make people understand what's actually really happening here? And we on the panel, as outsiders, as visitors, were sort of saying, well, yes, who is going to write this book? It needs to be you in the audience. But I notice often that it is somebody who has a little bit of a distance. Sometimes it is somebody from that culture who stepped aside and can look at it just from somewhere else. And I think we were talking about Khalid Hosseini's 1,000 Splendid Suns, which what I know about Afghanistan is mostly from that book. That was the book that made me understand, and it was a little bit, as Ciler was saying, about look after your neighbor. He took such personal stories and showed a whole country. And I personally think that's the most effective way, and I don't ever think of myself as a political writer, but I know that by telling a small story, as I'm seeing it at the time, or certainly at the beginning, often there's a big story that you're hinting at, that the reader is left with. The book I'm working on now, I started thinking I wanted to write something about love, but actually the other day, now I've written about 90,000 words, I realize it's actually about Catholicism and repression and people's inability to be accepted because of the time that they were born into. And love is trying to raise its head in there somewhere. And so I, as a writer, need to start with something. I need to start with either my neighbor or even myself, something I feel I can own, and then I can get to the bigger themes through a sort of vehicle that feels very close to my heart.
I liked what you said about something that you can own, you know. which makes me feel that, as writers, we have to feel strongly. We have to feel something in order to write about it, in order to make it authentic and organic on the page, so that it lifts the story, makes that connection with the reader. In that sense, I think all fiction is political. I think as a writer, it's very hard not to be political, especially if you're shaped by your circumstances as a writer. On the other hand, I think fiction is different from something like an op-ed or a column or a non-fiction book, even though a lot of non-fiction books in Pakistan are fiction. And a lot of fictional books are actually non-fiction. I think the difference there is that op-eds or journalism can be very black and white. It takes sides. It tells you what to think. And like I think it was Janne who said, literature forces you to think, to make up your own mind. And I think fiction allows you that grayness, that space for you to decide for yourself, to see both points of view, to feel empathy from the point of views of different characters. When I started writing my novel, it actually started off with a lot of research about female political leaders. But then I realized that it did not offer that space to really explore what women in power go through. And I realized that if I fictionalized it, if I put in more characters, because it was bigger than just one story. There were lots of stories. They're just, as writers, we are so surrounded by different incidents, by different things that affect us. And nowadays, with the whole concept of storytelling changing, Instagram has my story, Facebook has my story, Twitter has my story. Art and literature and the idea of storytelling has expanded so much that fiction, I feel, allows you that space to draw in inspiration from different parts of the world, different segments, different experiences, and to shape them into stories. And so, yes, I do feel it is political, and whether writers have a responsibility to be political, I think that's a different issue, in the sense that, can we write about something that we don't have the authority to? I think yes, we can, because we are tapping into those sensibilities, and we are offering you that grayness to make up your own mind about whether you agree with this political situation or not. So yes, fiction is political, and it should be political, and I don't think writers should be hesitant to own up to that sense. Often it does get you into trouble as well, and I think that's where we have to be careful. Unfortunately, unlike Turkey, in Pakistan, it's the fiction writers who are able to express political opinions more freely, because less importance, unfortunately, is given to storytellers than journalists, due to various factors, because of literacy, because writing in English is limited, and broadcast media has a wider reach, wider range. But again, coming back to that idea of human gap, it's literature which really fills in that gap and really makes people aware of the human condition. So I think in our country it's extremely important.
I studied political science and international relations, but that was the best choice that I could have in my family to survive. What I wanted to do was being an artist since I was born. And I had an interest in many things, but then there was one day I told myself, okay, you're not Einstein, you're not Leonardo da Vinci, just choose one, and what can you not survive without? It was writing, literature. So my father didn't let me to become a writer because he believed in trade, that I should become a business woman. he thought. Although we had this huge library in our books, he thought I could write only after I was 50. So he thought, okay, now just you need to study management. And I lied to him. I said, in Turkey we have this system where you can, where you get points for the university exam. It's a cruel system. And then you just end up in the faculty that your points meet. So I said, I put management. I didn't. I risked my life and my university life. I just put really 4 choices, and choices that were political science, because I thought, okay, girl, you want to be a writer, so you better read all of these: human history, sociology, psychology, economy, because that department has everything in it, and it's a great, great department to study. But then at the 3rd grade, and I told my father, you know, I'm just a girl, I'm stupid, I couldn't get that point, you know. He knew, I think, maybe not, I don't know, I didn't ask him. But so, but there was the 3rd grade that you decide if you want to become a politician, or you can choose the classes if you want to go in private sector. That was another moment that I had to face myself. I said, yeah, that's also interesting. You can affect lives like more directly. But who would let me write what I want in Turkey if I become a politician? I said, yeah, no, I want to be a writer. So I really stuck to being a writer. But having said that, of course, although I'm a fiction writer, everything has political and social elements in it that I write, because life is political, and especially in countries like us, as you were saying, you cannot really like detach yourself from the social life. But for me, the biggest difference between writing directly on politics or calling yourself a politics writer, I don't know if there's a term like that, and I don't really agree with genres as well. So for my 2nd book, they were like, oh, it's stories, but it has a structure of a novel. I said to my agent, do whatever you want with it. Call it whatever you want. I just want to write. So for me, fiction or literature has something that politicians don't have. It's the beauty of words. And to me, that is so important. But you can just snap someone with that word. You can just make someone dream with that word. So to me, that is really my distinction as a writer. Again, my own personal point of view. I need to stick to the beauty of words when I write. But what becomes boring in festivals, after all this excitement we're going through in Turkey for the last 5 years, they start asking you only political questions and not fictional questions anymore. So please, if you try to ask some literary questions so that I feel better.
Can I just add?
Well, I mean,
Can I just add to that? Sorry. Yeah. Very quickly. I just wanted to say it's good that you do get asked these political questions, because when my novel came out, the question I was asked was that, what qualification do you have to be writing about politics? You know, they were like, yes, you know, Umar Shahid Hamid, who's a Pakistani writer, has written a political novel. Muhammad Hanif has written a political novel, but you were never a journalist. You're not a police officer. What qualifications do you have to be writing about politics? And that really made me think that when has politics become an arena? Because as citizens, we all have these similar experiences which make us all political beings, and that's what differentiates us from animals, I think. Just wanted to add that.
No, fantastic. And I would also, I mean, I've also been thinking about the way in which literature and art connect to or comment on the human condition. I was thinking a lot about the science fiction author Ursula Le Guin, who's also had very deep political commitments, but spoke a lot about the human condition through works that really escape what we would maybe think of as, you know, realist fiction. To what extent do you think that realist fiction is the best way to capture the current situation of the human condition, or are there ways in which coming at the present from different perspectives can help us think about the situations that we're in.
I think, again, the more you can activate, does it work or not? The more you can activate the imagination of the reader, the more you can say about the human condition. It's, again, the more you add to reducing that human gap I was speaking about. And what is so important, and you touched upon it a little bit, this thing that we, as in fiction, always go from the individual. Because think about it, in social sciences and philosophy, they always speak about what applies to the many, and they get to their conclusions through the empirical research of what do the many do. In politics, where they try to guess at what will the many vote for if we do A, B, and C. Fiction is opposite. Fiction gets its truth from working through the individual. You get some characters to come alive, some persons, you get them hearts and feelings and perfections and many imperfections as the most human thing. And thereby, the reader feels, is this true or not? If the person does something, would you have done the same thing if you had these characteristics and this culture in that situation? Would you have done the same? So, and I think we have an innate human sense that of then what would a human being do? You know, we have, even with all our different cultures, we have quite a lot in common. We cry when we are sad. We might cry over different things, but we all cry when we are sad. We all smile when we are happy. And these things come in when we read literature. But you can make a totally fictitious universe and another planet. You can even have different kinds of beings, and still you work on those elements of what is universally human. You know, the sadness, the joy, what we consider, you know, the sensation of treason or wickedness or love. So there are these very basic human things. But as a fiction writer, you cannot reach anybody if you try to generalize about it. You have to make a story come alive through the beings you create. And even if they're not human beings, you know, like H.C. Andersen, the fairy tale writer of my own nation, you know, he made teapots come alive and have a love life, or a Christmas tree that first dreamed of coming in and be dressed in all this glitter and the hearts and the colors, and then he was happy to be in the woman. But then, you know, slowly as it was withering, and after Christmas when all the decoration was taken off of it, how sad it became. So you can make something innate come alive through, you know, in your fiction, giving it a soul, and then we'll identify with a Christmas tree or a teapot. But that's what I think literature can do, and it can be done in so many different ways. But it's always through creating individual beings that we feel for.
I'm always very interested in, as I attempt to create something in literature, if I have something I really need to say, I have to find a way of not telling my readers. I've just written a play recently, and so I had this experience of, it was based on a true story about a woman who is passionate about prison rehabilitation and decided that what she felt would make a huge difference to the prisoners, mostly men, most of the prisoners are men, to teach them to do very fine embroidery. And so I wanted to tell this story, and I did a huge amount of research about her. She was an upper-class English woman who's no longer alive, and I knew so much about, you know, the staff shortages and the prison population and the rise and the different politicians and how they'd made things work, etc., etc. Not a single one of these things in the play worked, because I was telling with such fervor my audience, please listen to this, these statistics. But what worked was when she was just engaging with the men that she's teaching, when she's saying, no, if you want to make a French knot, no, you mustn't start with a knot. What you need, those are the pieces that worked, and I was so fascinated by this that I had to go through draft after draft, getting rid of every single sort of didactic line in the play that told my readers about the terrible conditions in prisons and how it was so important that the laws had changed and that the politics was softened, etc., etc. But what I now hope, having finally finished this play, is that the sort of human element of the story will leave with exactly the same impression as if I had kept in all the pieces of research that I found out. And it's very heartbreaking as a writer to have to, to write so many thousand words and then just shred them onto your study floor. But that is almost always what you have to do if you want to actually connect with somebody, and not just on an emotional level, but on an intellectual level, because people are coming to fiction, to drama, to art, with a different part of their senses. And if they want just to find out things, as someone told me who read a draft of the play, if they want to know about this, they'll Google it. You don't need to put any of this in the play. And so that's something that is a really hard lesson to learn as a writer.
So I agree with that idea of the human element in fiction, which appeals not only to your intellectual sensibility, but also to your emotional heart. It appeals to your mind as well as to your heart. Besides being a writer, I also teach. I'm an academic. And when I first tried to teach a gender studies course to my undergrad students in Karachi, I felt it was, there was this blank walls, some sort of glass in between, and it was, people were just gulping down the theory, but they weren't relating to it. And I thought, why not try and teach it through fiction? And I brought to them these stories of Ismat Chughtai and Rashid Jahan, written back in the 1930s, about women trying to find a voice to talk about safe childhood, to talk about marital rape, to talk about female sexuality, and to talk about child abuse. And what was really interesting was, through these stories, a lot of my students were able to realize how much they had internalized this patriarchy and this misogyny around them, that they weren't even aware of the oppression that they were facing. And when they realized that, there were women 70 years ago, Muslim women writing about these issues, they not only connected, but they really understood what it means to be human. Why should human be divided into man and woman? Why should there be divide? And it's interesting for me that we talk about the human connection, the human gap, without realizing that there's still this disconnect within the word human, this disconnect between genders, which needs to be bridged as well. And fiction is a great example, literature is a great example, because it does that without sermonizing, without telling you what to think. So yes.
You mentioned Ursula Le Guin, one of my favorite writers. I'm going to mention Orwell. He's Orwell, a science fictionist. What he created in 1984, was it a real world? Is he a dystopian science fictionist or a dystopian realist writer? I don't know. I don't really want to hook up with like labels. But to answer your question, yes. Different forms of literature, I think, I've taken a note, sorry, can touch, explain, and foresee life in a way that maybe no one can. In Turkey, I have witnessed one part of this Orwellian novel, not only the control, but transformation of media. Because I was buying, it's been I stopped doing it maybe 3 years ago, but I was buying different newspapers every day. Really, even the newspapers that I couldn't stand reading, full of bullying, full of not scientific things, but I said, okay, I need to understand them. I need to, read them. And then I didn't realize, I didn't wake up to it for a while. I was like, why don't I feel I'm being fed and I'm, you know, when you eat something nice, then I wasn't really feeling full reading newspapers. And then I realized they started becoming the same. But it was such a gradual and sneaky process. Oh, now we have, in some papers, we have news service like press releases. Even we have, in some papers, we have the same headings, and they still call them journalists. So I have lived through that, and you know, those ones who read 1984, you know how they create news and recreate news and write history and rewrite history. So I'm witnessing this Orwellian book to my astonishment in Turkey now. History is being rewritten, values are being recreated, renamed, and media is being transferred into a press release. So yes, science fiction, other genres of literature, they can explain a lot of things.
And I suppose to pick up on that and something that Sabyn said earlier, I mean, in this context of, you know, this sort of mediatized context of competing stories, whether it's from social media or from the press, such as it is, I mean, what is the importance of novels and of literature as art in accessing sort of and presenting higher truths or different truths, or how do novels compete within that context, this highly mediatized context of competing narratives? It's a big question, I know.
Yes, it's a big question. I guess if we had the answer, we ought not to sit here, but sit and write at home. And it is a problem today because everyone is distracted by the demand of the immediate world right now that the digital development has allowed for. But I do think that every human being has a need for something more substantive than what's presented in those instances of modern media. In a sense, that's what Ciler was talking about, that you need to feel you're really fed. You can't live off of chocolate, even if it's nice for some moments. At some point, you will realize your body needs carrots, or you simply will die. And I think we are at that moment just before we realize as a broader humanity in this moment that all this social media, all this instant information is like the worst kind of cheap colored candy that's poisoning us, and we need more substantive food, even just to be happy in our own personal lives, not to talk about, of course, what kind of society then comes out of it. And art and literature, maybe because of the pace it works on, does feed us. It is the carrots in the meal of our souls. And without maybe I can define it completely, it's just I'm absolutely convinced about that. And well, maybe I can tell an anecdote that explains that. Many years ago, I was working in the United Nations for the peace process in Mozambique. I'm a macroeconomist by training, and there we saw quite a lot of horrors. The moment we came in, there had been a civil war, absolutely gruesome, where people's noses, breast, ears were cut off, and people buried alive. So you were negotiating with generals who had been in charge of these horrible massacres every day. You see them, and they were kind of human, and it made me question, you know, this thing, how can I just talk to these people who seem normal and know they have committed mass murders and mass rapes? And I got like totally depressed, and I brought a whole suitcase of books, and I felt like, what does it matter to read any one of them? You know, it doesn't change anything here in the brutality. And then somebody brought me from Europe the Northern Anthology of English Literature, which is 2 huge volumes. He brought just one, it was too heavy the other. And just to be polite, I started looking at it, and then for some reason, I started reading, you know, and memorizing some poems in it. I started with the shortest one, and the very first was Thomas Hardy's The Walk. That was written in 1914 when his wife died, and it had nothing to do with Mozambique. And yet, when I could say to myself, without looking at the text, it was like I got something, almost like Thomas Hardy's soul had given me something through the text he had written. And I didn't know what it was, but just gave me a little bit of energy, a little bit of a smile to go through the day. So I started memorizing other poems. And I never memorized poetry before. It's not something we grew up with in my time. But it was really like those different poems, whenever I'd committed them to heart, first of all, I understood the poems at a whole different level, but then they fed my soul. And gradually, later I could also start reading novels again that would feed me. And I realized really that how literature can be that salt and water that nourishes the soul. And maybe for other people it's different kinds of art, but for me it's literature that really does it. And poetry is the strongest in the sense that it's the most, I think, compressed form. Most is put in, it's like, the concentrated bouillon of all what a writer is able to give to it. If it's good literature, here I'm not talking about, the entertainment, but really good literature where the writer's given his heart, his soul, his blood, everything, then it feeds you. It is then the carriage for our soul that we need to be human being of spirit. And since then, for me, I've never, been in doubt what art can do, but you have to give yourself absolutely, totally to it, then it feeds us. And I do think that, at least when we are at our best, each individual of us, we realize when we are going off on strings that's just about superficiality. And what the media does to us, even when we participate in it ourselves on social medias, it makes us see our lives all the time from the outside. When we take pictures of everything and put them up as selfies, we see our lives how we would like to see it in the eyes of the other. We want to be seen rather than see. But real living is in seeing, in being, in doing. It's not in doing it in the eyes of the other. So I think the way will come and will transform, but how bad it'll get before, I don't know. But I hold to the long term and stick to being a literary writer.
It's such an interesting question because the whole idea of long form, short form, the ability of people to take in long form, i.e. novels, which is what is our living, is in question all the time. And I'm a mother of 3 children, and I see how when they were younger they read and read because it's what I provided for them and they didn't have so much choice. But as they are now half child, half laptop, they're losing the ability to really give themselves to something. And it's all about commitment. When you can just, in 1 minute, have an Instagram hit, and it's like a dopamine hit in your head, it's very satisfying. You get a like. I mean, my daughter, I have 2 sons and a daughter in the middle. My daughter's sort of maybe been more affected than the boys because she uses Instagram a lot, and so she puts these beautiful photos, and then she gets likes and then hits, and it becomes, but then it's good to talk about the soul. It does not feed her soul. I see her depleted by it, and there's nothing you can do, and I think about this a lot and I worry about it for them. The only thing you can do is act by example, and they see me feeding my soul. Mom, why are you always working? Well, I'm taking these hours to nourish myself because this is what I love passionately to do, because it's what matters to me, and I'm going to spend these hours on myself because this is important, rather than say, I know, I'm sorry, work so hard. Saying, no, this is of value to me. And actually I was very heartened because my daughter's now at university, and I rang her the other day and I said, what are you doing? She said, oh, I'm listening to an audio tape of Northanger Abbey and I'm painting a watercolour. And I was like, yes! She didn't tell me that she was breaking off every few minutes to see how many likes she got on Instagram, which is also probably the case. But I was so heartened, and I think that we have no power but to act by example and show people that there's a soul to be fed, and I don't think we talk enough about our souls, and that the word has kind of almost vanished. It's really lovely to hear you say that, because I know that there's certain things I do that nourish me, and other things that feel kind of thrilling, but they leave me so depleted. And a lot of that is connected with my phone, which, of course, like everyone, I'm fairly addicted to now. So, yeah, it's a really good question.
So one of the first short stories that I wrote was called And the World Changed, and it was about this little community in old Karachi in 1950s who would gather together around a car which had a working radio to tune in to BBC London at 9 o'clock at night, because they felt that state media was, was very government-led. It only told them what the dictators wanted them to hear. So to get impartial, unbiased news, they would turn to BBC Radio. But nowadays, I feel, now that we live in this era of fake news and fake news and postmodern era, I feel we are completely bombarded with information all the time. We have information coming at us from all ends, from Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, newspapers, television. And in that sense, I feel literature helps you transcend from information to knowledge. It helps you turn that information into knowledge because it gives you a broader perspective. And if it's good literature, then that knowledge gets translated into wisdom. And I feel, yes, we are being hit by these little bites all the time, social media, internet, but it's speaking at us. And I feel literature helps us listen. It helps us open our ears, and instead of speaking, as Janne said, instead of seeing us from the outside, it helps us be introspective and look inside.
So in an age when everybody is a writer, it's still nice to be seen as an exotic animal. When you tell others, what do you do? I'm a writer. Oh, how interesting. And then they tell you, oh, you're translated over 20 languages. And then you just come to your daughter's class and you just hear, I'm like, yeah, she's my daughter. She's going to school. I'm a writer. That's what I do. So this gives me still a little bit hope in this day and age where everybody is a writer. But do we compete? I don't think we compete we can compete. I don't think we can compete as the pace of the internet, because it just moves so fast and it just moves in such a direction that we cannot control. And human transformation or mutation, not always in the good sense, mutation maybe, it's inevitable. Maybe, I don't know, maybe the ways of learning, the ways of expressing ourselves, the ways will change, and then we as authors, fiction authors, will need to adapt to that. We will see this in our lifespan, I don't know, because everything is moving really fast. But I still, again, personally, what I try to do is to set an example for my daughter, and it's very motivating to see that you can plant seeds from your example, because I believe in that. As a parent, you can really affect your child in a good or a bad way. So I try to set an example because I always carry a book with me as well. So this 7-year-old girl, she always has a book in her bag whenever we go, and she draws me always with a book, even when I'm going to work in her drawings. I know that she will do more of the internet thing when I let her do it. Now I can control her life to a certain extent, in a good way, I hope. Things will change, but I still believe in the seed. Like, if you plant the right seeds, then there is more hope that they will pop up, and maybe then instead of getting likes, she will read more compared to her friends.
Well, I think we should open up for some questions if there's anyone who had, are there microphones going around? Just waiting for
my question is actually at the start of the session, the statement was here frequently that all where are the universes in the literature?
Can you speak up a little bit? Sorry, we can't quite hear.
Okay, it's all right.
Okay, yeah.
If all fiction is political, where are the universals in literature? Politics or universals? What is vital for a true art? Virtue, voice, or science?
Okay, and do you want to direct the question to anyone in particular? Or
Anybody.
Anybody.
As I understand the question, say, what is the difference between then the political in the art and the true humanity in art? And to me, it's that when you are working on a piece of art, and for us, I think, in literature, you're searching for something. You're not giving the answers. When you work in politics, you have decided upon which answer you believe in, and you implement it. And when, as a literary writer, you then you search for your answers, it will have a political implication, because depending on the thinking that will come out of that piece, it will change, as it does change the writer when you write it. It also, if it's any good, changes the reader, and that will change how they vote. So then it has a political impact. But it's a totally different way of working. And since I also do political debate sometimes, there I have to put aside a bit that searching soul that's more my insight, that I prefer, in a sense, to ask the questions that you do as a literary writer. Because in the political world, the answers matter. And even if you are not convinced, at least you must say the one that you most believe in is what you will try then to implement, because that's the political is again the immediate world. You can't say, well, we'll think about what to do about climate change the next 100 years. You have to just start doing something. So that's why you have to just go with what you believe. But that's for me the difference, whether you put the questions or the answers.
Should we just have
Should we do a group of questions, and then if you want to.
First of all, thank you for the wonderful discussion. I guess one of the things that I got out of this general discussion was that the very act of creating literature is imagining a human condition, or reading it on the other side is imagining a different kind of human condition. So I was wondering how you go about, as writers, deconstructing your characters, complicating your characters. Do you think about it in terms of categories such as gender, race, or do you try to transcend those categories by kind of ignoring them and, as you said, right, showing rather than telling?
Cool. And can we take a few more questions, and then we can, if there's any others, and there's one at the way.
Well, thank you for your valuable input. And I have a very humble question to ask anybody of you, that how would you respond that what is the impact of globalization upon local literature, values and culture, with special emphasis and background of in post-colonial states like India and Pakistan? Thank you.
And then there was a lady, a woman over here.
If I could ask. It's an interesting thing that we are actually talking about literature, and that can, right, when you say that as a writer, when you document something, that is something that is really affecting you. So as a nation, as we, Pakistan, a developing country, we have certain, economic, pressures or geostrategic position that the country is now taking on, as we as China, Silk Route and everything, and CPENG and all that. But still the literature is, it based more on a perspective rather than literature in a holistic view. So based in Pakistan and working and talking on literature and art and human condition, that there we are talking about the time of chaos and the anxiety, or whether there is a political bloodshed and all these things. But there are forces, and that can convert somehow our literature to our perspective, and that is very much limited. So how you guys can help us to bridge the gap, so that our literature, as a literature, because literature is something that can guide us, our generation and the generation that are coming after. So how can we can then develop this connection and bridge the gap? If you can guide me to.
Yeah. Is that, yeah. Now, or should we? Is there one more, and then Okay, just one last question, I mean, if you have the...
My question is actually kind of short. We talk about the political implications and the spiritual implications, but as a writer, which one do you have a greater responsibility towards? When you're writing a novel, should you be politically conscious, or just be feeding a spirit, or just writing for the self?
Okay, cool. Do you guys want to... Who wants to start? Do you want to go first, Sabyn, and then...
So I think that's a really interesting question that you asked, if the idea of representation, that you feel that perhaps the immediate concerns are not being represented in the literature which is coming out. I would have to, I'm not sure I wholly agree with that, because I think what's happening is the non-availability of publishing. Perhaps because we hardly have a publishing industry, which is something a very pressing concern. We don't have a single big publisher which publishes fiction, especially in the English language. We have academic publishers and we have a few niche publishers, but no mainstream publishers. A lot of writers have to look abroad, especially to India, to publish. But as far as writing, which is organic and representative of immediate concerns is concerned, I don't think that's correct, because I just put together this anthology of creative writing by young students of a university, and the issues that they were writing about things from a son seeing his mother go through menopause, to a killing in Gwadar, to the disappearance of the missing bloggers, what the families have to deal with, the remarriage of a person, of an activist wife who was tired of waiting for her husband to return. And I thought these were all very immediate, very pressing concerns. So perhaps the literature which makes it to mainstream bookshops, that perhaps may not be as locally representative of the immediate concerns of people like us. But there is a lot of writing coming out by Pakistanis. They are writing on different forums, blogging, on these little e-magazines, self-publishing. There's a lot of writing going on, and not just in the English language. They're writing in Punjabi, they're writing in Urdu, and through various mediums. There's poetry, there's plays. So the expression is definitely there. What is lacking is the opportunity for them to reach a wider audience.
I'm aware we don't have a huge amount of time.
I'm happy to answer. I think the two questions, one about character and spirit, and the other question about spirituality and politics, are quite similar. That as a writer, you have a lot of things that you want to say often when you start a book, and it's like about really holding them all in your head and finding a path through the story in the most effective way that you will be able to communicate with whoever is reading. And as I described earlier with my play, you don't really know how you're going to do that. And it's a real trial and error, and very satisfying and very challenging process. And you often think, oh, wouldn't it be incredible if this could just come out exactly as I want to say? And that is the reward, because sometimes it does, but mostly it doesn't. And it doesn't mean when you read through it that the bit that came out easily and the bit that took 100 drafts, you can't really tell which is better. It doesn't count for anything. It's just sometimes your thoughts and your emotions are linked up and in sync. And but I think that it's very important to hold all those things together and not be too judgmental of yourself as you're writing, but to kind of be committed to what it is you want to say ultimately.
Ciler, do you have anything to add? I think we've probably got to end it there, but thank you all very much for coming. Thank you very much to the panel for an amazing all of their books are available in the bookshop. And I would just like to add that if you want to stick around, there's an unscheduled talk from Hugh Thompson about his book, Nanda Devi, which will be following on straight after this, so stick around.